Coming up, comedian, author, and human encyclopedia Kliph Nesteroff joins Illeana in just a minute.
Welcome to Popcorn Talk, featuring movie discussion, news, and interviews. Popcorn Talk, we talk movies. And now, it's the I Blame Dennis Hopper podcast, starring Illeana Douglas. Eavesdrop with Illeana as she interviews Hollywood's most prominent players about filmmaking, acting, and what really happens on the set of your favorite flicks and TV shows.
Hi, I'm Illeana Douglas. Welcome to I Blame Dennis Hopper, my co-host, Tamara Berg.
Hi,
Hello.
everybody. Hi.
We've got a great guest today. Kliph Nesteroff wrote a fantastic book called The Comedians, sort of an encyclopedic knowledge of comedians. Very fascinating book. We're going to talk to him. I want to talk about a comedian that is in the news, Amy Schumer.
Right.
This is incredible. Last night she was performing her act, and she all of a sudden started to talk about a little anti-Trump, little politics.
Yep.
And was asking people in the audience about, Trump's advances against women, etc. And 200 people got up and walked out angry, said, we just want you to make us laugh. This isn't the platform for this, and walked out.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting. One of the things that we sort of brought up was, would they do that for a male comedian? And I know you and I tend to talk about, women's issues a lot. And sorry if you're not into it, but if you're going to like us, you're going to have to like this about us. But, would they, or would it, your assertion was, would it get polite,
I feel
clapping?
like that if it was a guy comedian, if Adam Carolla stood up there and said, hey guys, I just want to talk about something very serious, that people would applaud. That's my gut feeling. But that a woman doing it, it was just an excuse to get really angry at her and walk out. 200 people walking out. I mean, that is again, something like that. When buyers see walkouts like that, do these people, I'm not sure, do they demand their money back? Is that, that can be problematic.
Yes, John.
John,
producer.
on
Yes.
the couch.
One of the producers.
Do you think that's because of the political climate, or because I think it has a lot to do with the political climate, not just because she's a woman? Because I think if it was done in let's say it was 6 months
Wrong.
from now.
Wrong. No. You're wrong.
That's it. I'm protesting. I'm walking off now. I think it's. I don't think you can not have that be part of that equation.
Well, one of the things that's coming up on Facebook these days is people posting pictures of food going, when is the election? When is when are things going to be over so we can go back to what Facebook is really about, cat videos and pictures of what you're eating.
Right.
So, I mean, maybe that was the thought that they left just because it didn't necessarily have to do with the issue that she was discussing or the people that she was discussing, but just that they flat out just didn't want to, they just wanted to laugh.
It becomes very tricky. This is something I've talked about on the show, Trailblazing Women show. If you create a role for yourself as a female comedian, and maybe your style is to go a little raunchy, and that's your brand, I think that when you veer into another direction of, now I want to be taken seriously, because I notice a lot of, I'm not on one side or the other, I'm only commenting, a lot of the flack that she then got was, and for this person, and she's posed naked and put all these naked pictures up of herself. There's a huge backlash.
But even that, I mean, a lot of times she does that in reaction, meaning as a stance, as to say. So I don't think it's out of her brand to make this an issue, because it seems like she's done that in the past. So for those people who thought that was out
not
of
what they were going to get,
this is Amy Schumer. She's done this before. Why were you expecting something different?
No, you had said though there was another element to the timing of it, in that during her stand-up there were women who were
she wanted people in the audience to stand up to identify themselves as victims of sexual abuse. This could be, I guess, men or women. And that, people started booing her, and she was probably again using it as a moment, a social moment. I mean,
and
you look at Lenny Bruce.
That's what I was going to say. Lenny Bruce. I mean, comedians have a long history of being a moral compass.
I think that is, as an entertainer, you have to know maybe the climate of, the audience that you're portraying, that you're in front of. I remember an experience where I was doing a play, and at the curtain call, I was going through like a rough patch in my life. My grandmother was ill. She was, gonna die. And it was a very emotional play. And for some reason, one night, I just found myself, the audience was really responding. And I found myself I didn't even know I did it, but I did the sign of the cross. I genuflected, like, thank you, and I kind of did this. And people in the audience started cheering me, right? I didn't even think of it. And then I was sort of full of myself, and I'm on stage, so I started to do a kind of genuflect, and the producers got really mad at me. They didn't want me to do that. It was like, what are you doing? Why are you? And I said, it's a personal thing. Me and my grandmother, a certain prayer I'm doing, They were not happy, so I stopped doing it. So that was my brief little, kind of, my experience as an entertainer is that it's very tricky to walk into social. It's like, we all have our hands on the Twitter. I noticed how I dated myself. I was doing a typewriter, and then I had to go like this.
Thumbs, lady, thumbs.
Yeah, it's thumbs. But, where you're about to say something political, and then, I work for a corporation. Maybe I shouldn't do that.
But we were discussing how when did audience get so
sensitive.
touchy and sensitive. You can't sit and listen to somebody else, even if they have an opposing viewpoint. I mean, you have to. I mean, they have every right to walk out if they want. It's a free country. They can walk out onto whatever.
Yes, they can.
Yes.
But the fact that you couldn't just sit there and let her make her point and
then let it move on and get to the next thing.
It's like everything has to be a protest.
I think issues like that. This is comedy, and we'll be interesting talking to Kliph too about comedians have a role in our society. They're commenting on society, but underneath all comedians is really like they're
truth.
Yeah.
That's
so I think that sometimes comedians, and I saw this, it seems like with people like George Carlin or Richard Pryor, it starts to become it's like cooking down wine. It suddenly becomes very distilled what they want to talk about. And
Smothers Brothers were great commentators on what was going on in the world.
I think eventually all comedians just want to get down to, no, now I just want to talk. I want to really communicate with you from my soul. They sort of need to go through that phase, and then maybe after that layer back on the comedy, possibly.
Didn't you do some stand-up for a while yourself?
I very briefly did some. Should I do my first ever joke on stage?
Oh yes, bring it.
Let's go back to 1987. I've got hair up, big,
80s hair,
big 80s hair, and a big white clip.
Nice.
And I went on stage, and it was so funny. It was October, and I got on stage, and I said, "Oh, God, well, it's autumn in New York. I always love when it is autumn because the bums begin to turn yellow and fall. It's just fantastic." What? It's my first. I still got
That's it. Now I am in protest. I'm leaving.
I live right down the street. Where on the other west side, where it's no longer what street do you live on, but what Starbucks are you near? And I was saying, and giving in this context, in 1987, when this was just happening, it literally like brought the house down. I was like, no, you can't even give directions. It's kind of like, okay, so you're walking up Columbus and there's a Starbucks, and then you're going to cross down to Amsterdam and there's a Starbucks, not the Starbucks on 72nd, the one across the street, where the bank used to be. Now it's a Starbucks. So it was, I'm killing.
You are.
I'm killing here with my jokes.
I think you might need to think about going back on stage.
And I would do the hippie stuff.
How long did you do that?
a very short time because
Was it only in New York?
it was hysterical because I was working at Stand Up New York, literally because I needed the money. I entered this contest and I won $50, and then
Whoa.
they liked, they were like, we'll put you on the bill, and I told her I used to walk from my apartment on 69th Street, and I would do my material for my roommate, and he'd say, "You're not funny." I was like, "What? It's funny. Like, how hard could it be? Like, I'd only have to go up for like 10 minutes, So it didn't even seem that hard to string together, 10 jokes. But they would put me on bill with only female. It would be like ladies' night. So, and then you wouldn't go on until like, I was like,
Oh, good Lord.
10 o'clock at night, and I got a little manager of sorts, and he sent me up. I remember having to take the train to Mount Vernon, New York, and do this performance. And I left at 1 o'clock in the morning. Talk about groped. It was like, when wasn't I groped in these early, I used to say to the other female comedians, like, did Bruce, like the Mr.
Get any
Octopus?
action,
And,
any action from Bruce last night?
and they'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'd be like, okay, maybe it's, okay, but I was always navigating that. And then that trip to Mount Vernon, I remember like having to get home on the train, and it was like I'd spent most of my money just getting there, So the life for me was not great. And as soon as I got into, and that's when I was in the sketch comedy group too, called Manhattan Punchline. But I got I got that little gig in New York Stories, and I was like, adios comedy. But I would do my little routines, as I wrote about in my book. I would do Martin Scorsese. One of my crazy routines was called Raging Bullwinkle. So I would do, Rocky, did you fuck my wife? And then the squirrel would go, are you out of your mind? Are you crazy? So I would do this routine, and Marty would say, "Oh, you got to do that routine for Bob." And that was, I've talked about like this before, literally the scariest thing I've ever had to do is face Joe Pesci and Robert De Niro
Doing Raging Bullwinkle?
Yes.
Nice.
And luckily for me, they both laughed.
Yeah.
But I couldn't stomach the world was like, the comedians, you'd finish and it would be midnight, and they'd say, "Okay, well, now we're going to go on the train and go down to Catch a Rising Star." I was like, "No, I'm going home. I'm exhausted." Plus, I didn't have any money. I was like, "I'm going to save my money. I'm not going to go down." So the life wasn't for me. But years later, I sort of put that into doing the living room show, because I do love commenting. I mean, doing a joke, now and then about current events. And I have tons of friends who are comedians, and I worked with a lot of comedians: Gary Shandling, Jay Moore, Drew Carey, Adam Carolla, many famous comedians that I've worked with, Buddy Hackett, Jerry Lewis.
Oh wow!
So I'm fascinated by comedians, absolutely fascinated. Even I, growing up, not as fascinated with female comedians. Joan Rivers.
There weren't many to choose from. Though,
Moms
growing up.
Mabley.
There's that.
There wasn't too many. I did like Mae West. She was sassy.
Yes.
I liked her.
Yes.
I thought she was good. But anyway,
I think we should bring in Kliph.
let's bring
Don't
in
you,
Kliph Nesteroff. Want to see what he has to say about this Amy Schumer situation. Kliph Nesteroff. Kliph, did you bring in your book?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Bring in your book, please. You may replace my book. I will permit you to replace my book with your book, which is, you got the paperback already.
Yeah, it hasn't come out yet.
I love this.
Oh, exciting!
Exciting and new.
Kliph Nesteroff is here. The comedians.
Headphones for you there.
All right.
Put that on. I will put my book. Now you have. It's so funny. Kliph and I, we wrote a book at the same time.
Yeah.
Exactly the same time.
Yeah, came out. Our books came out at the same day, and mine's coming out on paperback October 25th. And yours is coming out
November 8th.
November 8th. Wait, the day of the election or the day that
I think the election's on the 4th, isn't it? Or the 3rd?
the 6th?
Neither of us
God,
know.
I know we're only 20 days away.
Campaign's only been happening for 7 years now, and we don't know the date of the election. I think mine comes out
right.
after the election.
Yes.
Which was
The
a
election day is the 8th.
No.
Yes, it is the day
Your
book
book
comes
is
out.
coming out on the election.
Yes,
Well,
it is.
there you go. There
So
you go.
once
My publisher was a little bit concerned because I'm going to New York that week to promote the book, and they're like,
Yes.
good luck getting some coverage.
No, you don't need any help. Your book has been is on many. Tell us some of the. It's been on like lots of best lists.
Well, I don't want to toot my own horn, but
Sure
if
you
Go ahead.
do.
if you open the flap of the book, there's
Let's
all
see.
the up-to-date things. I think it
Oh
says
my God,
best
this
book
is
of the year.
amazing. I know.
National Post, Best Book of the Year.
Yeah.
Los Angeles Times, one of the best books of the year. LA Weekly, a best book of the year. But that was last year, so
Best-
it's
Oh,
not
yeah, but
even
so we're gonna be going for best paperback of the
best
year. this year.
paperback of the year. I hope.
perfect.
So
hope.
I followed Kliph. I know nothing about books. I just was like, I was thrilled that I could even complete a book. But like, I don't understand any of the like, oh, you have to get quotes and.
Oh, yeah.
Did you find that?
Oh yeah, it's like anything in show business. When you ask your friends for a favor, it's like you have to apologize 10 times and go, you don't have to do it if you don't want to.
Right.
Because it's always somebody else asking you to ask somebody for that favor. You know so-and-so, could you ask them to do this?
Yeah.
So you always don't want to do that. But then you're in this circumstance where you have to ask, and it's very difficult. But I lucked out. You know, I asked Mel
Yes.
Brooks, which was pretty ballsy.
Wow.
And he gave me a quote for the back of the book. And Mark Maron, yeah, actually the 5 people that I asked, they all gave me the quote, but I did it with
Wow.
great trepidation and
Yes.
apology.
So now, terrible question. Do you have a favorite comedian?
Well, I usually say Mel Brooks because it's like a non-controversial answer because everybody loves him, you know. But as soon as I start playing favorites, then I start to lose credibility as a objective historian because if
No.
somebody doesn't like that person, then they're like, well, maybe they don't respect my opinion.
You know, I've said this about Mel Brooks. You know, when Sid Caesar died, and once Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner go, like that's it,
Yeah.
right? Mike Nichols is gone. But more, I think that when I think of comedy, and when I interviewed Carl Reiner, I said this too. Like my introduction to comedy was watching my parents listen to 2000-Year-Old Man, Mel Brooks and
Yeah.
Carl Reiner, and laughing and
Yeah.
kind of going, okay, I want in on this. I
Right.
don't know what this is, but something they're doing on the record is engaging my crazy alcoholic parents.
Right.
So
Yeah, Mel Brooks to me is like a universal in terms of like appeal. Young people, old
Yeah.
people, all generations. And usually when a comedian gets older, Don Rickles or whoever, they become less funny to the new generation. But Mel
Right.
Brooks can still go on Conan O'Brien or Jimmy Kimmel and destroy.
yeah.
Everybody else who's that age who would go on that show, we would laugh more politely, if you know what I
Yes.
mean. Not uncontrollably or impulsively like we would with Mel Brooks. Even Don Rickles, who I love,
Right.
he does a lot of the same shtick whenever he's on the thing, and he's getting older, so sometimes he has better days than others. And so when we laugh because we love Don Rickles, not so
Right.
much because of impulsively just uncontrollable laughter. But Mel Brooks, you don't have to even know who he is. He comes on one of those shows and he'll make you laugh. He destroys. So he's sort of like this anomaly, a space traveler in comedy where he appeals to
Yeah.
everybody no matter how old he gets, doesn't lose any energy whatsoever, remains universally hilarious. So I usually say Mel Brooks is my favorite for that reason. you know?
Yeah, he and Carl Reiner seem to their material just didn't date. Now, who are some of the comedians that just do not that you write about that don't sort of travel well currently?
Almost all of them. I mean, Milton Berle is like that. When we think about Milton Berle, he was the biggest star in comedy.
Yes, he was.
Late 40s, early 50s. And
And for people who don't, I mean, it sounds hard to believe because we
Yeah.
know these
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
But like, let's go through some comedians and like, what do they know? Because it's one of my favorite things in the world. Like Jack Carter,
Right, Jack Carter, yeah.
based an entire career on like what
Yeah, well, there was a lot of guys in that era who just kind of had a shtick that
Yeah, I love that.
they outlived their own shtick, though, So there was
Yeah.
these guys who were at the height of their fame during the Ed Sullivan Show, but when
Right.
the 70s came along and a new crop came up, they weren't really
Right.
able to adjust. So if Jack Carter performed at a comedy club in the 1970s, he would feel a little bit alienated because he was still doing the same style, whereas these new kids were talking about their lives, contemporary issues. But Jack Carter's premise was always these kids today, but
Yeah.
his audience now was those kids today. So you can't say that to those kids. It's like today, if you go up and you're shitting on millennials as part of your act,
Right.
and that audience is all millennials, they're going to kind of reject what you're saying rather than relate to it or accept
Yeah.
it. So you have to know your audience. So a lot of comedians, as they get older, they're not able to adjust. They're still performing to their same age group, understandably so. But if you want longevity in comedy, you have to learn how to have that wide appeal to all generations. Otherwise, you're only going to be, when you're 70, your audience will be 70, and that's
Right.
it. So
And
Jack
then-
Carter was sort of like that.
And the we were mentioning Milton Berle, and of course is he like the first comedian that has like a major television?
Yeah, more or less. The
Success.
Texaco Star Theater, which was his show in 1948, they initially didn't know who they wanted to host that show. They had a rotation of 4 hosts for the first 6 months. Milton Berle was one of them. Jack Carter was one of them. A guy named Georgie Price, who's completely forgotten, a mimic, was one of them. And the other spot was sort of like a rotating thing where they said they were going to have Groucho Marx actually host that show initially, but he never did it. But after a while, they discovered that Berle was pulling in the best ratings. He was also just the most television savvy. At the time,
Right.
he had his own 6-night-a-week stand at a nightclub in New York. So when you saw him on TV, he was basically doing exactly what he was doing in nightclubs at the same time. So he really just kind of knew how to play to that camera at a time when nobody did. The only reason Ed Sullivan had a TV show is because nobody could do a TV show, and he
Right.
couldn't either, but he did it, and so
Yeah.
he became famous. But he was the least photogenic, telegenic guy you could ever imagine, and remained so for a long time. And Pat Cooper, an elderly comedian, said to me, he goes, nothing else was on. We didn't know any better. Ed Sullivan wouldn't get on slides today, And it's true. Like there was nothing else really on. Your competition was just grainy old monogram movies,
Yeah.
So a lot of people became stars at the start of TV, late 40s, early 50s, who may not otherwise have become stars later on when people had more experience,
What do you think is the idea? I know when I was a kid, I was fascinated by comedians because they would always wear a suit.
Right.
That was like my, I don't know why I thought that was fascinating as like a 4 or 5 year old. Watching him on Ed Sullivan, you'd see, Buddy Hackett or any of these older guys, Jack Benny. And what is the part of the suit mentality?
Well, back in those days, and some of the old guys still believe this, that you should be
Jerry Lewis. who wears
you
this-
should be a step above your audience.
Yeah.
It's part of the sort of theory behind the raised stage, that you are superior to this audience. You're dressed better than them. You're amplified for a reason. What you have to say is meaningful. But if you dress the same way as the audience, you're kind of at their level.
Right.
And I used to have this philosophy when I did stand-up. I would never drink anything before I went on stage. A lot of comics would. But if I was drunk, then it brought me to the same level as that audience. You know,
Right.
I wasn't a step above, but they're all drunk and I'm sober.
Right.
I'm faster, I'm quicker, I'm more aware of everything. And a comedian should always be faster and quicker and more aware of everything other than, more so than their audience. So I think the suit, again, it's just a sense of professionalism that
Yeah.
tells people this is a show, I'm the important star of this show. Guys like Adam Sandler, they don't care. They go up there in baggy volleyball shorts and stuff like that, which is fine. They're still funny,
Right.
but at the same time, it's also a bit of a distraction. Although maybe these days wearing a suit would be more distracting. I'm not sure. But
Well, there was Drew Carey, remember? I love Drew Carey because I thought that was such a throwback. I was like, oh, this guy's interesting. He looks sort of like a throwback. And I love the Drew Carey show, too. Now, do you get into let's talk about some of the female comedians, which there aren't, too many. We were making a joke about Moms Mabley.
right. Well, Moms
Joan
Mabley
Rivers.
was one of only 2 solo stand-up comedians, women in that era. And I do get criticism about that in my
That
book.
era being when? The 50s?
1930s and 40s.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Really
and then,
early.
And in the 50s and 60s, people like Toady Fields, Phyllis Diller,
Right.
Joan Rivers came along. But I get criticism with my book because people say, well, how come there aren't more women in your section about the 30s and 40s? I go, every single one is in there, that was doing
Right.
stand-up. But women who were doing comedy in those days were more actresses. Claudette Colbert
Right.
was a comedian in movies. She wasn't doing stand-up. Stand-up was a
Right.
vocation that was pretty much reserved for men. And if you were doing comedy in nightclubs as a woman, you were usually part of a comedy team like Burns and Allen, or you were doing like song parodies or sketches. It was like cabaret is what they called it,
Right.
as opposed to straight stand-up. Even Moms Mabley was going on stage in character. She wasn't as herself talking
Right.
about her life. But a woman named Jean Carroll started to do that around the late 30s, early 40s when her husband enlisted. They had been in a comedy team, but he went off to war, and now she had to fulfill all these engagements they were already booked for. So she adjusted her act and went solo and figured out a way to get rid of the setup straight lines and just did the jokes herself. And she became one of the first real potent female stand-ups of her time. And if you ever see Jean Carroll's work on YouTube, there's a couple clips. She's like a Rodney Dangerfield. It's like joke, 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 just boom, boom, boom. And she's hilarious. And it's a very
Right.
contemporary feel and style to it today. Like if you look at some of Jean Carroll's material, you'd still laugh impulsively, I think.
I think it's hard. I mean, again, and I very briefly did stand up back in 1987, 88. And in those days, they would separate. You'd be on like ladies' night.
Oh,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
And the trouble that I had, which is probably what a lot of women would have, is I would get up there. I never really found my voice. I would just kind of get up there and be funny and
Right.
tell things. But that's where I always found it. I found personally to be uncomfortable as a woman on stage. It felt so confrontational. It was late at night and people were drinking, and I was like, ugh, I'd leave with kind of a bad taste in my mouth. And some of the female comedians, that were going, that was just the beginning of understanding that when they would talk dirty, it was like the audience just really responded.
Yeah, I still don't really understand what
That
the
became the
hang-up
brand.
was. Yeah, I still don't understand what the hang-up was and is, despite doing all this research, why there was like this rejection or barrier from many audiences to a female on stage. And you hear old guys like Milton Berle come up with these stupid theories like, well, it's not ladylike to hear a woman telling jokes. A woman should be a lady. And you're like, what are you even talking about? What does that even mean? So I never really understood that.
Yeah.
But it is a hostile environment to be surrounded by drunk men if you're a woman, period.
Yeah.
And so that is kind of where
Yeah.
your job takes place in a comedy club, is surrounded by drunk dudes. So
Right.
that alone creates an atmosphere that is not desirable, really, for developing an act. You're fighting, you're battling these idiots at all times. It's very difficult to develop material in that circumstance. So I think just general sexism had more to do with keeping women from doing stand-up than any other consideration,
Yeah, because once you didn't, Phyllis Diller had or Joan Rivers, their brand was kind of like they could talk about their husbands and that was that was their brand. But then that kind of got thrown out the window too. I feel like one of the only successful people was Ellen, that she was able to just talk and kind of be funny. I was always sort of sad that she became a successful, she moved to, I think a lot of these comedians, you find that like the minute they become successful, they're like,
Right,
all
they
right,
leave
I'm-
stand-up,
I'm
yeah.
done with stand-up. But she was one of the few people I thought that was like, oh, okay, she was onto something.
There
here.
were a few people in the 80s like Margaret Smith and Wendy Liebman and Laura Keitlinger who were more low-key and brilliant.
Right.
And I think it was just an evolution of America getting used to what stand-up was as an art form. Because if you go back further, Toady Fields, Phyllis Diller, Joan Rivers, I hate to use this phrase because it always seemed a little bit sexy or sexist, but they described them as brassy.
Right.
But they were loud, they were fast, and it was like a survival thing. The drunk guy in the audience isn't going to yell, "Show us your tits," if you're speaking fast and quick,
Right.
Whereas in the 80s, somebody like Margaret Smith, Wendy Liebman, and Ellen, much more low-key, quiet, measured. And I think it was a survival thing prior to that, where the women doing stand-up were much faster and louder and weren't able to really just be a human being talking.
Right.
But I think all stand-up kind of evolved into a little bit more of a human art form eventually. Because even a guy like Jack Carter or Milton Berle, when they're up there, they're talking loud and fast, and they're not speaking like a human being, nor are they talking about their own life. They're talking about the guy and the girl went to a doctor's office. The doctor said, it's never about them. So stand-up evolved in a way over the course of history. Because when it started in the teens, 20s, 30s, it's still a very new art form. Just like silent movies could not be more different than contemporary cinema. It's an evolution that takes place over the course of many, many years. So stand-up the same thing, and women in stand-up the same thing. Now, hopefully, we're at a place where people who are funny can be themselves on stage without the social pressures of trying to be something else.
Well, we were talking, about the thing that happened last night with Amy Schumer, 200 people walking out because she wanted to talk about, a social issue, political issue, and then comparing that to somebody like Lenny Bruce. And does a comedian do themselves an ill service by, as somebody yelled out, "We just came to see the jokes,"
Right.
Did they get themselves in trouble? Should they only be funny?
Well, I mean, funny first and then everything else second. But it's funny how people distort what came before, the same way that, right-wingers will say, well, these protesters today should be more like Martin Luther King, when it was these type of people that would have rejected Martin Luther King,
Yeah.
It's the same thing with comedy. They say we just came here for the jokes, but I'm sure a lot of those people's favorite comedians are like social commentators, like George Carlin and Louis C.K. So I don't know the context of that Amy Schumer thing. 200 people walking out sounds like a coordinated effort to me. We're all 200 of those people together, because that seems really absurd that instantaneously that many people would walk out of anything, really.
No, I don't think they were. I don't think it was. And it was a pretty big venue from what I understood too. Yeah.
I've never heard of such a thing, but
It was she got into a topic that obviously troubled people. She wanted people to stand in the audience that had been victims of sexual abuse.
Right. Well, that's maybe making people uncomfortable and awkward, as opposed to laughing or doing material about the subject matter.
Yeah.
So I could see that in a way. I don't know. There's lots of comedians out there who, and I'm not saying Amy Schumer is one, but who like the idea of making people uncomfortable.
Yes,
you know
I
what I mean?
agree.
You go to a comedy club,
I agree.
and that's the reason nobody wants to sit in the front row of a comedy club. They're afraid they're going to be put on the spot and made uncomfortable. And then there's people who take the cues of an Andy Kaufman, a guy like Eric Andre, and they want to make the audience confused between reality and fantasy. And it's not just about laughter. It's about like a performance or an effect on the audience. For me, I love pure comedy that just makes me laugh. And it could be political, but it's got to make me laugh without me even thinking. Really, it should be like a reflex. That's when you know something is truly funny. If you're laughing without thinking about it, without trying to laugh or not laugh, you just laugh. To me, that's like pure comedy, and that's like the sweet spot you want to hit.
Who does make you laugh in particular? Because you're such an expert and you've been exposed to so much of it.
Yeah, I usually don't. I'll say, but I usually don't say, because if it's anybody's least favorite comedian, then this book suddenly loses all credibility, And I don't describe anybody as funny or unfunny in the book for that reason.
You just did a historian.
Yeah. Just I'm telling the stories of these people who did comedy, regardless of my opinion. But these days, I love. Norm Macdonald is one of my favorite. I think he's got one of the most unique points of view. I love who do I love? Well, Norm Macdonald is right up at the top. Oh, Brian Regan is a guy who I think is really conveys what I was saying. Just pure funny. I saw him in Jamestown, New York recently do 90 minutes. And it was like physically painful in the face after a while from just laughing so hard. He was just an absolute natural. But I really love most comedians. I really respect anybody who does stand-up, and I defend a lot of comedians who are not cool or popular to like. Like a lot of people love to hate on Carrot Top or Jimmy Fallon, but when they do what they're good at, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Anything that makes somebody laugh, I think, deserves a little bit of props.
My favorite is George Lopez.
Really?
Oh my God, he is so. I was aware of George Lopez from television, and then I got cast in a pilot, and I went to see his show because we were doing the show, and I mean, he's like a superstar. Again, it was one of these wake-up calls, like, oh, I'm white. I'm not I'm totally. I am totally unaware
Right.
of like this stadium.
Right. Well, that's the other thing
and
about
it killed me because it was ethnic, and my roots are ethnic.
Right.
Italian.
Right,
I love.
So you were able to relate to it on almost a different level. But the
He
same.
was talking about his Mexican grandmother chasing him around, come here, and hitting him with rings, and it like that to me. I love ethnic humor because that's what I grew up with around Italians, and we kind of got away from that. It's the commentary. It's like you said, the white guys commenting about this and that, but it's very au courant, very cultural, and I have the old school, like I love making fun of your cultural identity.
Well, Russell Peters is now the master of that. That's all he does is specific cultures, hitting on the cliches and the stereotypes and making everybody laugh. Because of it. Sometimes we forget, a guy like George Lopez, we'll see him on TV, we'll see him in a sitcom or a movie, we forget that they're stand-ups almost.
Yeah.
And there's certain people that you don't understand why they became famous until you see them do stand-up. And you're like, oh, they're a master at this art form. A guy like Louis Anderson, if you're not going to see him in Las Vegas, you might even forget that Louis is around until recently with the TV show. But again, he's a master of stand-up. He's been doing it since the late 70s. So even if you're a snob and you enter that arena thinking you don't like Louis Anderson, you're going to be slayed. He's going to kill you, because he's such a master at that art form. And Norm Macdonald is another guy. A lot of people don't even realize he's a stand-up. They know him from SNL and that's it, So stand-up is a very unique kind of art form that takes years to master. And there's a lot of people that are just dynamite at that more so than anything else. And I could definitely see that with George Lopez. I mean, that was...
And then old school for me is Albert Brooks.
Oh, Albert Brooks is...
Comedy
is
for One.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his two
What I
records are great.
listened to again and again. And then when we were in high school, we would listen to Richard Pryor. Cheech and Chong a little bit. It wasn't really my cup of tea.
Right.
But I thought it was fun. We laughed at it and stuff. But
I always loved Up in Smoke. I thought that was the kind of apex of Cheech and Chong.
But we bought comedy. Did you do that growing up? Buy comedy albums?
I mean, when I was growing up,
Python?
when I was growing up, I was buying them in a thrift store because it was no longer vinyl was no longer an entity. But one of the first records I ever bought, the first 3 LPs I ever bought actually were all comedy records in 3 different genres. One was Monty Python Live at Drury Lane. The other was Stan Freberg with the original cast is what it was called. And the other one was Wayne and Schuster live in comedy performance. Now Monty Python are British absurdists.
Yeah.
Wayne and Schuster were a Canadian comedy team, and Stan Freberg was an American satirist from the 50s. So there's 3 very different styles, but I loved all of them. And George Carlin I really discovered through his records. Like I had known him from like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, but I didn't know I didn't know that he was a brilliant stand-up. Same with all these people because I'm a little bit younger than people would expect based on my subject matter. And Don Rickles I first saw in a sitcom called Daddy Dearest with Richard Lewis. He played Richard Lewis's father. It only lasted a season.
Wow.
And Jonathan Winters I discovered in a sitcom called Davis Rules. Again, just a 1 season.
Yeah.
None of these things were particularly good.
Yeah.
But that's how I knew who these people were. But then I went back and started collecting records, and I bought the George Carlin record, FM and AM, and I listened to it, and it was hilarious.
Yeah.
And I had no idea that George Carlin was George Carlin. I just thought he was Rufus from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Oh, God.
But yeah, that really gave me a whole new universe. Comedy records, I started buying every one I saw in a thrift store, no matter if I liked them or not, or knew who they were or not. And eventually I had 1,000 comedy LPs.
I have a question for you because growing up with listening to comedians, there was always like a hard rule of like, you didn't work blue, like that was crossing the line, or only certain comedians, Red Fox. Or it was like, he works blue and, but nowadays, in order to communicate with kids, you have to use sort of am I?
I don't know if you. I don't know that you
sort of vulgarity.
I don't know that you.
communicate?
I don't know that you have to, but you don't want to be using colloquialisms from the 1940s either. You know what I mean? Like
Which I do all the time.
You want to use whatever.
Like gangbusters.
Yeah. You want to use whatever language will help you connect and relate and communicate. And I don't think it's so much the comedians have to work blue. It's just that off stage now, most of us don't have to worry or think twice about using a swear word generally, unless
Yeah.
we're around our grandma who's old school or something. But in general conversation, if we swear, it's not a big deal. Whereas 50 years ago, it was a very big deal, you know? So I think just it's sort of the evolution of society as opposed to, because a lot of older comedians will say, well, 4-letter words, the easy way to get a laugh. Maybe in the 60s it was. But now
Yes.
if you say a 4-letter word, it's so common that it doesn't get an instantaneous laugh at all. So
No,
Well, and that's a little like wearing a suit too. You know, I mean, it's more, as you were saying, it's kind
Yeah.
of unusual to be wearing a suit now. And
well, no, my complaint a little bit with watching some of these young comedians, they go out and they're like, dude, what the fuck? And
Yeah.
you send me a dick pic, and I'm like, is there a joke in here?
Right.
Like I'm sort of waiting for the.
Right. Well, there's-
I'm old school, like construction setup.
yeah,
joke.
absolutely. It's this. There's a sloppiness to stand up now that there never used to be.
Yeah.
But at the same time, through your sloppiness is how you find your material. Hopefully, when somebody does a stand-up special, they don't sound like that. But when you go and see them in a club, they often do, because there's a sense of disposableness when you're working out material on stage now in a comedy club that will have somebody talking like that. But hopefully it gets refined to a point where all that extraneous rambling and ambling about for what you're trying to say is what's the phrase I'm trying to find? It's distilled so that it's
Right.
perfect, hopefully, you know. I was always a writer, so when I did stand-up, it was always very meticulously phrased, probably to my detriment because I wasn't very good yet. Had I been rambling about it, I probably would have been able to write on stage and create more material, but I was
Right.
very specific to what I would write out. But I like that respect for the art form, the George Carlin or the Louis C.K., who is meticulous about the phraseology, about getting to the punchline using the least amount of words necessary. And it does drive me crazy, a lot of modern stand-up where it's just ambling and just, oh, what the fuck is this? You know, this fucking guy, fucking
Yeah.
that. And it's not even about swearing. It's to me more about superfluous words.
Yeah,
you know.
just sort of bridging, I call it vamping. Like they're kind of vamping, and I kind of can't really follow the joke. Now of course I love, I'm obsessed with old movies, and I talk about film history.
of course.
But in terms of your book,
Yeah.
why is it important? Why is it important to know the history of these comedians and of American comedy?
Well, I don't know that it's important. I think people could live a full life without ever knowing anything about it.
It's not important.
But it does help.
Next guess.
It does help. Context. History is context. So if
Yeah.
you know history, then you are prepared for the future. So I won't get political here, but if you know your political history, then you can foresee current political trends and the parallels, and that's forebodingness, you know. So it's the same with comedy in a way. I get interviewed all the time about political correctness. Drives me crazy. They'll say, Kliph, so you can't joke about anything anymore. What with political correctness and all? And I'm like, you can't? Norm Macdonald, Bill Burr, Louis C.K., Sarah Silverman, Amy Schumer. Compared to the 50s, it
Right.
sounds like you can joke about anything now.
Yeah,
and
I
that
agree.
50, 60 years ago, you couldn't joke about anything. So it's the opposite, but people kind
Yeah.
of fall into these ideas without knowing their history of, and make judgment calls based on that. But if you know your history,
Right.
then you also know your present and you have perspective. So for me, it's important because it gives you perspective on what's happening now, what might happen in the future. Likewise, when I get criticized that there's not enough women in the book, and that could very well be true. There could always be more women in the book. But if you don't know the history of stand-up, then you're going to come to that conclusion that there's not enough women in the book. The reality is there's not enough women in the history of stand-up. You know what I mean?
Right.
In the 30s and 40s. So once you have a clear idea of where we came from, then you know where we're going. So that's why it's important.
I love it because I like to know, if you're planning on becoming a comedian, so you're not just standing in front of a mic like vamping and like you're thinking you're funny when you're not really funny, but looking at comedians and going, oh, okay, Bob Newhart, he had this particular style, and looking at all the different people
Right.
and kind of adapting, saying, oh, I think I want to go in the vein of Albert Brooks. Like for
Right.
me, I was like, I want to go in the vein of Albert Brooks.
Yeah, well, when I was writing this book and I was trying to decide where to start it, it starts in vaudeville. I was like, I don't know how to make vaudeville interesting for like a contemporary audience. I certainly can't like show examples of material and say this was hilarious, because it won't translate at all. You know, it's a different
Right.
time period. But as I was researching, I kind of hit on the pulse of how to do it, which was to explain what the lifestyle was for a comedian in the 20s. And I realized it's basically the same as today. You know, it's a different era, it's a different style, it's a different venue, but these comedians started with nothing in terms of material. They went in front of an audience, they tested their act, it either worked or it didn't, and they slowly whittled away what didn't work and built up what did work, and created an act and toured around and became good, became famous, or they never became good. But that's the same today. So the stand-up circuit today is very similar to the vaudeville circuit in terms of what the comedian has to go through. You have to suffer in front of people on stage and bomb and not be good in order to learn how to be good. So that's the way I made it tangible, you know, by correlating those.
Well, there must be I mean, I always think with comedians, again, I've worked with so many comedians, and most of them are so dark, have been so troubled and so dark. And what is that need to be alone on stage with a microphone talking, you know?
I think the need is a narcissism, frankly.
Well, I have to say they're not the easiest people to act with, because you have to constantly go, now I talk.
No, it's
I know
absolutely
you
true.
talk.
It's absolutely
you
true.
talk and talk. Now I talk.
No, absolutely. I mean, I've done a lot of panels since this book came out with comedians on the panel, and I'm supposed to be the star of the panel, and then I realize, oh, it's a fight, like puppies fighting for the teat, because everybody just is used to being on stage alone, and they want to be the focus of attention. So you really have to fight to get your words in and hold your sentences before somebody interrupts. It's very, very difficult. But yeah, comedians very selfish.
Yes, and they never laugh too. And I remember when I would work with, you know, like a Drew Carey, or I guess I think of myself as funny, and I'd be like, "Hey, Drew." They just stare at you.
Give it the
Like,
Illeana
I go,
deadpan.
come on, that's funny. You know, or Gary Shandling was the worst too. I was like, hey, Gary, what if I do this? Yeah, I want you to walk in the door. I mean, like, come on, that's funny. But yeah, they got to be the funny ones.
Yeah,
they always have to be the topper. The other thing I was gonna say, just talking about film comedy.
Yeah.
Tragedy for me would be that they got rid of the old Max Sennett Studios, which was which is the center, the beginnings of comedy, of filming, where they threw the first pie, and that's all gone. And just again, the origins of the early film comedians. Do you have any favorites?
Well, you know, I find it really interesting. Just recently I was thinking about this, how much I love Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd. But the things that we remember about them and the clips that we see are not necessarily funny. They're stunts, which are actually very serious.
Right.
So it's a house falling on Buster Keaton, or almost getting hit by a train, or Harold Lloyd dangling from the clock. But there's actually no joke there. It's just peril.
Yeah.
They're like, you're watching the greatest stuntman of all time. And I just was thinking about that recently, going, the movies are funny, but what we remember about them are not the funny parts. It's those visual things. And for me, what I love about movies, period, my favorite movies are visually striking. And it frustrates me today that last 30 years or so, comedy films are very boring to look at. They might be funny, often they're not, but it hinges on dialogue. And I'm a writer, so I understand that, a script is great, but if it's a movie, it should look funny. My favorite comedy film is Playtime, Jacques Tati. And it's because to look at, it's a feast, you know.
Right.
The aesthetics are funny, and there's all these visual gags, and that's what I love about that era of the Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton. There's so much to look at by virtue of the fact that there was no sound. But there's nobody that I can think of that's really visually doing anything exciting in comedy films.
That's a great point, because you think of like Frank Tashlin and Jerry Lewis.
Exactly.
Everything is kind of like bright.
Cartoon.
Did you ever see the movie The Girl Can't Help It?
I love it. Yeah.
Opens with Jane Mansfield. She's walking down the street. She's holding 2 milk bottles.
Yeah.
That's how the movie opens. But it's like, you're like, oh, there's gonna be a wacky comedy.
But it's a visual feast. There's a great sequence in The Girl Can't Help It where jukeboxes are being thrown out windows from up above, smashed into the street, and it's just this visual feast. Jerry Lewis too, The Nutty Professor, the color and composition in that film. Disorderly Orderly, Frank Tashlin directing Jerry Lewis, has this hilarious sight gag that ends the movie where he falls out of the back of an ambulance on a stretcher and goes down a hill. But instead of just going down a hill and crashing into something, the hill lasts for like 10 minutes. He just keeps going further down, all these things in the way, like he's almost getting crushed. And then he finally crashes into a grocery store, and cans come flying out the grocery store door out into the parking lot, propelled on their own propulsion. You know, these cartoony gags, they're so enjoyable to me, you know. A movie should be something that you can enjoy to look at, not just to listen to.
Yeah, that's a great point. When I think of the current comedies, they don't have any sort of visual style, or specifically, I guess a little bit, we have directors that are sort of known more for comedies, but even that is, you know,
the bar tends to be pretty low when it comes to comedy, because we can think of a great drama that comes out every year, a movie, maybe 9, 10, 15 great dramas a year, maybe. We'd be very fortunate to find one great comedy every year. And when we do have a great comedy, it's kind of us settling for, have you seen This Is the End? It's really funny. Yeah. Compared to the lack of everything else, you know. I know. So comedy in cinema to me is frustrating, because I love the history of film. I love Billy Wilder. I love Jacques Tati. Maybe it sounds pretentious to expect comedy to be like that today, but I feel like of all the film genres, it's the one that tends to be to have the worst batting average in terms of the stuff that comes out.
Yeah, well, we're getting very sloppy, and they also say too that American comedies don't translate overseas, which is so interesting, because of course they used to. We used to have sort of a universal. Everybody would laugh at Charlie Chaplin or.
I think also a little bit of it has to do with marketing. If you call a movie a comedy, there is great pressure on that movie to be funny. No, seriously. Like, but if you don't categorize it, and you just let those, if you're not expecting a comedy and a movie is funny, you're gonna love it a lot more than if a movie is marketed as a comedy. You're almost like demanding it to make you laugh. Yeah. And I think a lot of filmmakers feel that pressure that there has to be a joke all throughout the movie, even if it doesn't fit. That's why a lot of comedies today, you see somebody sitting on a toilet reading a newspaper or a fart, because it's just thrown in there, you know, rather than having the comedy come out organically of the story.
Well, you know, that's something Carl Reiner said, was that there's not enough time to set up the story. Right. And so they have to go to something like toilet humor so that everybody is on the same page, but they don't have the time to set up a sophisticated, you know, thing like they did in the Dick Van Dyke Show or Your Show of Shows.
There's also almost not enough license given to the audience to be subjective about what's funny. I love A New Leaf, Elaine May.
Right, me too.
But I bet if you watched it with an audience of people, different people will be laughing at different things at different points. Yep. Whereas now, the guy in the toilet, everybody's supposed to laugh at that, or the fart, everybody's supposed to laugh at that. But there's a subtlety to the Elaine May school and the Jacques Tati school and even the Billy Wilder school, where while there are these moments with huge laughs where everybody will laugh together, there's these other grace notes, little details in the background that'll make you laugh if you're paying attention, you know? Yeah. So I kind of miss that, and I wish there were some kind of renaissance coming in comedy and film.
Sometimes there's a relief. I know with the Turner Classic Movies, they showed in CinemaScope at the Cinerama Dome, It's a Mad World. And I mean, to be in that audience, every single person laughing at this crazy, silly movie was such a wonderful feeling.
Yeah, I was there for that. It is the best way to see that movie for sure, because it's meant to be a spectacle and you can't really truly appreciate it. And for me, there's an extra novelty just spotting all the character actors popping up. Oh, there's Zazu Pitts for 1 second. There's Eddie Rochester Anderson. Oh, there's the Three Stooges as firemen. Like there's a game to it almost, like spot the star or spot the now obscure character actor, that it makes it very exciting for me to watch. That being said, if somebody says they don't find it funny, I could also understand that, because comedy loses its potency over as the generations pass. So I never get into an argument with a younger person or even somebody my age who doesn't find something funny. I mean, that's, to me, that's fair. You know, no two people in the world, I think, have identical tastes in comedy, no matter what. I think there are always, no matter how close you are in terms of taste with somebody, they will always find one thing funny that you don't, and vice versa. So to argue it is silly. But I love Mad World, and there's certain movies that just, again, about the visual sense, to see it in a theater. Same with Jerry Lewis's Nutty Professor. That movie I don't think can be truly appreciated until you see it on the big screen and see the composition of shots and color. The first time I saw that movie in the theater, I had this sort of light bulb. I went, oh, that's how the French saw this movie for years. It wasn't on late night TV like us. They were still showing it in theaters, in cinematheques. So of course people have an appreciation for Jerry Lewis there because they're seeing him in the right format and context. So
one of my favorites is, believe it or not, is Abbott and Costello. I love Abbott and Costello based on the completely horrible enabling relationship that they have. It's like, if you think of his modern context, poor, Lou Costello
getting
is
slapped around.
Yeah, he's always getting hit. And my favorite thing is Bud Abbott's like, you gonna take that from that guy?
He goads him,
He sort of goads him into, and they don't play Abbott and Costello on television anymore.
I love Abbott and Costello, and a lot of these guys, I think you cannot really appreciate them until you've seen a bunch of them. Like to just see one Abbott and Costello movie, you're not going to be hip or in tune with their persona. In the 40s, everybody knew who they were, so they didn't need that additional setup. But now, as more decades pass, less and less people know what their relationship was, what their persona was, so they're less likely to laugh. But the more Abbott and Costello movies you watch, the funnier they're going to be to you because you know kind of what the dynamic is, and you can anticipate these things. And when the monster is creeping up behind Lou Costello and he's poking, but it's just funny. And it's funny what you said about the way Bud Abbott treats poor Lou Costello.
It's terrible.
I went and saw Buck Privates. They showed a 35 millimeter print at LACMA at 1 in the afternoon. I was the youngest person there by about 100 years. And there was maybe only 30 people in the audience, all elderly. But I can't go to the LACMA anymore to watch movies because the audience tends to be very rude. There's no self-awareness after the age of 90. But I was watching Buck Privates, and that was happening where Lou Costello is getting slapped around by Bud Abbott. This old man behind me starts heckling the screen. He goes, "That's cruel! That's cruel!" Like he got mad.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Got mad at Bud Abbott for the way he's treating poor Lou Costello. But
see, I loved all that. I thought that was, and I love the Marx Brothers. Of
course,
They were like my, growing up, I loved Groucho Marx. I was sort of...
Well, you've got that book there, the Leonard Maltin Great Movie Comedians book.
Stolen from, I used to steal because I was poor, so I used to steal books like from and feel like it was okay.
The library police are going to come after you.
I had to confess to Leonard that I had stolen this book.
I'm sure he's flattered though.
But I discovered that's why I said like books like yours are important. I mean, I read these books. That's how and then I would go to the movies.
Me too.
Look at I'd stare at, did you ever do this? I'd stare at a picture before I'd even see the movie.
Yes, absolutely.
And then I'd be like, oh, one day I'll
absolutely.
get to see that.
Well, it's funny, this
scene,
era of film book, the 70s, these movies were still so elusive.
Yeah.
You'd have to comb the TV guide in the hopes that the Late Late Show would show it. Now with DVDs, YouTube, TCM, thank God we have access to all these things.
I know.
But I used to study those kinds of books too. There was a book by Michael Medved and his brother before he became a political pariah called The 50 Worst Films. And I was, again, black and white photos. You're studying them like the Torah, And they were all movies I wanted to see. It was called The 50 Worst Films, but I was like, no, I want to see. One of the movies in there was Northwest Mounted Police, which is a Cecil B. DeMille movie, and Trouble Man, starring Robert Hooks, which was a blaxploitation movie with a Marvin Gaye soundtrack. And literally only within the past couple of years have I finally seen every movie in that book. But I did study it. There was this golden era of film books in the 70s.
Yeah.
These brilliant researchers, I don't know how they did it before the internet. Giant anthologies about the RKO girls, the Paramount girls, and these huge biographies and great photos. And that really did get me interested in cinema and movies. And certainly I had books like that showed all the old comedians, and I desperately wanted to see all those films for sure.
Well, it's fascinating because you see the tie from Bob Hope to Woody Allen, and and again, I love stuff like that, finding a trail.
The trajectory,
Yeah, finding the trail. And you say, oh, Mabel Normand or Mae West. Listen, like Mae West was...
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Sort of the Amy Schumer of her day, way ahead of time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I succeeded in doing this with my book, which is to connect the dots. Sometimes it's hard to find the connection between a Mabel Normand and a contemporary comedian because I saw a documentary a little while ago about the Catskills, and they showed all this black and white footage, and it said, if not for the Catskills, there'd be no Seinfeld. And then they cut to a image of Kramer coming through the door on Seinfeld, and I was like, well, that's a real leap of logic. It might be true, but in order for it to be true, you have to explain what happened in between.
Yes.
You know, you can't just say Catskills, Seinfeld. The connection is they're both Jewish. No, there's got to be one generation influencing the next generation that influences the next generation that influences the next generation. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense, you know. Louis C.K. makes sense in the context of George Carlin. George Carlin makes sense in the context of Lenny Bruce. You know, one person leads to another. But sometimes with stuff like that, they'll try and lead A to Z without all the letters in between, you know what I mean? So I try and do that in this book.
Well, your book's coming out on paperback
November 8th, yes.
November 8th. And are you going to write another book? Are you going to go on tour? What do you?
I would.
What's going on?
I would love to write another book if I didn't have to actually write another book. Right?
We used to commiserate. I was like, I can't write it.
It's so difficult to write a book. It's so much work. The one thing I liked is the fact that my deadline was 3 years away. I liked that luxury.
I hate you.
Oh yeah, you had a year
I had
less.
like a year.
Yeah.
No, I was like, oh yeah, 9 months. I signed this thing, and I was like, oh, that seems like forever.
Well, to be fair, the first year I did no work because I had 3 years. I was like, well, I'll just read. You know, that'll be my research. And then I'm just reading, you know, books that have nothing to do with comedy. But I would like to write another book. I think I would like to do something that is probably the completely wrong career move, which is to write about a completely different topic. Because now I'm established as the comedy historian, I can cash in on that, and I am. But at the same time, I don't want to write another book about the same subject. You know, now that I have delved into this realm of pop culture history, I'd like to do something else. That's
what other subjects interest you?
LSD is one of my current fascinations.
Interesting.
I've been kind of gathering notes about all the people who are very mainstream that were somehow influenced in a positive way as opposed to a negative way.
Yeah, Cary Grant.
Cary Grant, Larry Hagman, I just learned recently, got over his fear of death in the 60s from LSD. And right before he died, he was interviewed by Joy Behar. And she was being kind of cheeky. She goes, now, I read that David Crosby from Crosby, Stills and Nash turned you on to LSD. What was that like? He goes, oh, well, how much time do you have? And everybody laughed, but he wasn't joking. She goes, well, what was that like? Well, what did it do for you? And he goes, it took the fear of death away. And just totally calm as he said this. It was almost before he died. And she goes, well, what does that mean? Did it stick? He goes, all these years? He goes, yeah, it just took away the fear of death, so I have no anxiety. Like, he was so calm about death because of it. So those kinds of things fascinate me.
Do people still take LSD?
Not at all. It may be the least popular drug out there, which I find kind of interesting because in the 50s, it was considered a psychiatry breakthrough. And then within 10 years, it was considered the devil's drug, you know. So that shift is what I find fascinating. I just ordered a book. It's 700 pages. It's a medical book from 1965 called LSD and Alcoholism, about how it could cure alcoholism. And it's this very scholarly thing full of footnotes. But like 2 years later, all that research was thrown out as if it never existed, you know. So I'm learning that when used properly and applied in the proper context, it does have all these very therapeutic and sort of psychological breakthrough capabilities. I know you're not going to get on board with this, but
no, I was just going to say, I was saying, as a researcher, would you have to take LSD?
Well, I did when I was a teenager.
I'd be terrified. I saw all those about Sonny and Cher. They showed us the Sonny and Cher movie in high school.
The Sonny Bono, yeah. Well,
I was like, that looks terrifying. It worked.
But you know why that film was made, right? Sonny Bono got busted for narcotics, and then part of his court deal was that he had to do this
community service.
Yeah, he had to host this anti-drug thing.
It worked on me, and
saved at least one soul.
Well,
and the drugs.
Again, growing up on the commune, I certainly.
Well, yeah, that's why I said you won't get on board with this,
but I saw people on acid. It's scary, and although they were having fun, I never saw anyone have a bad trip. It looked really scary.
Well, I mean, it's all about context, is what I've learned. So I would not tell somebody to do acid and then go to the mall. It will be a bad trip.
Yeah.
But with the right preparation in the right context, I'm coming out with a podcast soon about the history of comedy, and one of the episodes is about comedians and LSD, because George Carlin and Richard Pryor became George Carlin and Richard Pryor after their LSD experiences in the late 60s. Both had been these kind of crowd-pleasing, Las Vegas pleasing tourist acts, doing fairly well, but both felt like they weren't doing what they actually wanted to do. They were doing what they thought would get them a response, but not what they actually believed. Then they both did acid in the late 60s, separate of each other, and were suddenly given this new sort of semblance of bravery and started becoming more honest on stage. So I found that very interesting. And in the 50s, with the researchers that were using it, initially they would give you acid in a clinic, like in a hospital,
Right.
which is not really ideal because, you know, if you're tripping on acid and there's a guy with a clipboard and he's like an authority figure, it's going to be like not what you want. So there
Right.
were this new wave of researchers in the late 50s who would take you out to the woods, out to the ocean, and then do your acid trip, and they would have these incredible revelatory experiences. One of whom was this guy, Lord Buckley, who was a 50s beatnik comedian who influenced George Carlin, was friends with Lenny Bruce. He was the first comedian to do LSD, and it was part of this research experiment. They wanted to see the effect of LSD on the comic mind, if it would have anything. So they gave him a dose of LSD in Lake Arrowhead and had an invite-only audience. And then Lord Buckley performed for like 15 hours.
Oh no!
The most brilliant
Oh my God!
stuff.
Is there audio of this?
Apparently, somebody did go and pick up Mort Saul's Ampex tape recorder, because not everybody had a tape recorder
Wow.
then, but apparently it was played so much over the years that the tape deteriorated. But James Coburn was in that audience, and Jonathan Winters was in that audience watching.
Interesting.
And at one point, Jonathan Winters, who wasn't on LSD, came up on stage and improvised with Lord Buckley for like an hour. And everybody who was there said it was like one of the most brilliant things they'd ever seen.
I love it.
Gobsmacked.
I know that sounds
Like
interesting.
jaw.
Well, that'll be- yeah, that sounds like a fun book. I
I
would
think
read
you
that
should
book.
write that book. I
Yeah.
would read that book.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating, just the paradigm between before and after.
Yeah.
When it was accepted and then when it was rejected.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? With no middle ground, like some of this research is valuable, some of it is not. Maybe we thought too much of it, blah, 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 whatever.
Yeah.
It was just like black and white, 1966, it's illegal. That's the end of all of it, you know, locked
Yeah.
up. Despite very respectable people, the publisher of Time Magazine, even in recent years, I think Steve Jobs had said that it gave him an epiphany or some kind of thing. All that kind of stuff
Yeah.
I find very
Well, I think
interesting.
all the history of drugs in America, and you know, even cocaine use, and you know, and then once the government gets involved, everything just gets skewed.
Or when people go with reckless abandon, you know. When I was researching this book, I would go through the archives of Variety, and in the 70s, the classified ads are all like, need actresses for this, a casting call for this movie.
Right.
In the 80s, suddenly all the Variety classified ads say, need help, addiction problem, can't get off cocaine. Like, it's like,
I know.
everybody thought, oh yeah, it's just like smoking pot, you know. And
Yeah.
no, sir, it's, you know, one of the most addictive things you could do.
It is. It's one of the sad things in the early movie. You know, they were all addicted to morphine.
Right.
I mean, really.
Isn't that interesting? Every generation has
Yeah.
their weird sort of thing they think is okay, and then later on, but now it's probably
discover.
prescription drugs.
I think it is. It's
Where like,
oxycodone.
here you go, this is okay for you, and then
Yeah.
years later, everybody's got a problem with it.
Well, I would definitely have to say I'm not a drug user, but I'd be more into up things than the dulling. I'm like, who wants to be? I don't understand. I never understood the appeal of downers. Like, who wants to feel down? Like,
Right.
I would want to. I like the Dexedrine days. Like, I would have fit. I love like 58. I want the Kennedy years. Like, yeah, give me a shot of that
Well,
B12.
we could definitely write a lot of books if we had that, you know. No sleep, just all week long, just writing, yeah.
I like that, seeing Sid Caesar, you know, like jumping around. You're like, yeah, that guy was definitely like getting his Dexedrine, you know, shots.
Got a trim figure and getting a lot of work done,
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway, Kliph Nesteroff, thank you so much. Your book, The Comedians.
Yes.
And please come back anytime you want to talk about
Thank you for having me.
movies
Absolutely.
or
thank
comedians.
you for coming.
And as we always say, everyone's life is a movie with a beginning, middle, and an end. This is the end of our show. Thanks for listening to us. What were you saying?
Yeah, and you can buy Illeana's book on Amazon, or it's out in paperback now, or in bookstores.
Yeah. My
And
book's coming out
check
too.
out our Facebook page. Our website is illeanaspodcast.com. There will be more info about Kliph there, lots of good scoops. So thanks for hanging out with us, everybody.
Thanks.
you
Have a
next
great
time.
day.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only, and not necessarily